So, we have a tier list today. We're going to be going over all of the defenders for the new Rainbow Six Siege season. Starting off with Alibi. I think Alibi is probably, like, it's in between D or C for me. I'm going to go with D for now. She's not really all that useful. She has a bailiff, a good gun, and an okay ability. That is literally it, though. And we're going to see later on in the tier list that there are operators that have that, but have more, which is why I'm placing Alibi so low. I might move her up later, because I don't really know how the tier list is going to look from now on. But Alibi in D for now. Let's talk about an operator that is slightly better than that, though. I think that's going to be Aruni. I've rated Aruni pretty low in tier lists in the past, but I think the ability to set up site however you want to, by having an infinite amount of holes you can make, is really nice. I think on certain sites as well, Aruni is good, especially like really close range ones, because having the ability to lock down the site late in the round is pretty powerful. The DMR is really good as well, so I think Aruni is a little slept on, but she's a good operator. Not like broken, which is what S tier is like broken operators that need to be nerfed, but definitely one of the best ones that you can bring. Next up, I think Smoke is also a great operator. Definitely top 5 solo queue operators in my opinion. But again, S is reserved for people that are broken, not people that are really, really good. So I'm gonna stick Smoke in A for now. Next up is Mira. I think Mira's a really good operator, but she is situational. There are some sites where you can't really bring a Mira, or if you do, it's not gonna be all that good. The recoil on Mira's Vector is very easy to use. She has Nitro Cell, a very good ability, especially if you pair it up with Wamai, so Ash and Kali can't counter it. Mira, very, very good operator, in my opinion. Now, somebody else that is situational, depending on the site, in my opinion, is Castle. I do think Castle is a little bit less situational, depending on the sites, but still a good operator, in my opinion. Anybody in situational, by the way, is not worse than the people below them, or sorry, not worse than the people above them, and they're not better than the people below them. So I'm not saying that Mira is better than Alibi or worse than Smoke. Think of the situational tier as like off to the side by itself. Regardless, anyways, let's go over the next operator, which is going to be Scopos. Scopos, honestly, I don't know of a single site where Scopos is not useful, and every time I use Scopos, she seems pretty useful. I think she's definitely like a top tier roamer, and the only reason people really rate her lower is because I don't think they honestly know how to use the operator. This might seem like a hot take, but Flash is really, really good. The ability to counter every single shield in the game now is pretty nice. She counters shields a lot better this season than she did last season because she guard breaks every single shield with every single zap, especially Blackbeard, right? She is a hard Blackbeard counter. So Clash, I think honestly, in my opinion, could move up to A tier. But here's the thing, if they're not bringing shields, Clash is a complete waste of a pick. So I'm going to put her in situational. She's good on certain sites, and she is good against certain compositions. If you know they're going to be bringing shields and they're going to be rushing, Clash is pretty good to go. But other than that, I don't see her being useful, so I don't think in my right mind that I can put her in anywhere but situational. Next up, let's go over Azami. Azami is going to be my first pick for the S tier. Definitely broken in my opinion, not because she needs to be nerfed, but I think the concept of her gadget is just so good that no matter what they do to her, she is just going to be a good operator. I will say one thing that counters her really well that a lot of people don't realize is DMRs. If you have a DMR, you can spam down Azamis with under one magazine very, very easily. We're talking Twitch DMR, Lion DMR, Dokkaebi DMR, whatever it may be. Great counter to Azami, but other than that, Azami is pretty powerful. She has a Deagle for sight setup, a very easy to use SMG, impact grenades to trick walls through drone holes or to protect your Azamis from Hibana. Either way, I think Azami is definitely a broken operator and the first operator that I'm going to put in S tier. Why is my face cam like halfway cut off? Hold on. Okay, my face cam looks normal. There we go. Let's go over Thorn. I think Thorn is pretty bad. Probably the worst trap operator in the entire game, hands down. The only thing that makes her good is having a deployable shield. But if you want a deployable shield and good weapons, you could just bring Warden, you could just bring Ella, or just an assortment of other different operators. So Thorn is pretty bad in my opinion. Next up, let's go over Cav. I'm not going to put Cav in F tier. I do think Cav is actually a lot better than people realize. The only issue that I have with Cav is two things. One, her primary weapons suck. Her SMG is terrible. If they upped the fire rate of that SMG, she'd be a lot better. Two, her silent step ability does not really work all that well. To be honest, I can still hear Cavs when they use her silent step ability, and if they have cutoff drones, her silent step ability doesn't work for flanks either. And in the higher ranks, everyone has flank drones, zero cameras, gridlock tracks, so she can be actually pretty useless, especially in the higher ranks. But I do think, especially for a solo queue environment, which is what I'm making this tier list for, Cav can be pretty good. Cav can be actually pretty good. Next up, let's go over Echo. I think Echo is going to be our first C tier operator. Not quite as good as the people in A tier, but definitely still a good pick. You have an ACOG, a deployable shield, or impacts, and an ability that's pretty good at countering shields. Although, to be honest, if you're a good player, the stun doesn't really do anything for you except for take audio away. I think Echo's pretty nice, and as somebody who knows a lot of Echo Cam lineups, even I'm going to tell you he's not that good of an operator, but still pretty good. Anybody that's in C tier, by the way, is somebody that you could play every single round and it'd be fine. A tier operators just have more of an impact. D tier and below is where it's like, you really shouldn't be playing these operators. There's not really a point. Next up is Bandit. I think Bandit and Cade and Turbo for that matter are all situational. There are some times where it makes sense to play a Cade over a Bandit, like if Thatcher is banned, right? Sometimes it makes sense to play Bandit over a Cade if Thatcher's on the board. Sometimes it makes sense to play a Turbo if you know that like they're gonna be trying to do a wall execute with an Osa and they're gonna take a long time trying to delay that with a Turbo, or just helping your Cade trick is nice. But there's just certain situations where some of these operators are worse than others, which is why by definition, they're just situational. Next up is Solus. I think Solus is probably D tier. I don't think Solus is as bad as people think, but I definitely don't think that she's like a good operator. Nah, I'll put her in C. I think Solus is a C tier pick. I can't in my right mind put Solus in the same category as Thorn and Cav, to be completely honest. That's just, that doesn't sit right with me. You have the ability to deny a lot of information. The shotgun SMG-11 combo absolutely smacks, especially with the new shotgun buff that they're introducing this season, which essentially just tightens the cone of all the spread of shotguns, which is pretty nice. And I mean, just having information is always going to be good. So I think I'll put Solus in C tier. I think that's fair. Next up is going to be Capcan. I think Capcan is a great pick for most players. For console and PC, I think he has one of the highest win percentages in the entire game, and that's for high elo, not low elo, which means even in high elo, Capcan is still a very good operator. You have an easy to control SMG, which he talked about on Azami, and a nitro cell, and one of the best pistols in the game. If you watch my pistol tier list, you can know about that. But I just think Capcan's really good, especially on console, when people just do not shoot Capcan traps for whatever reason. Trust me, I've played console. Capcan's pretty good. I think actually on console, he is the highest win percentage. So that just goes to show how good Capcan is. Speaking of somebody who gets played a lot on console, let's go over Doc. Doc, I think, honestly, is an A tier pick. The heals are pretty nice. I gotta admit, heals are great. Bailiff to set up sight. Easy to control SMG with an ACOG on defense, which is absolutely broken, and you have barbed wire for information. Doc just kind of brings it all, and for a solo queue player, Doc can be a very, very good operator. For the same exact reason, I'm going to go ahead and put Rook in A. I know a lot of you may be saying, well, Rook, you're putting Rook above Echo? You're putting Rook above Alibi? Yeah, I am. I mean, honestly, you might not think that Rook is a good operator. I get it. But you cannot deny that Rook has had the highest win percentage on PC for the past, like, 2 years. That's just a fact. He's had the highest win percentage for high elo players in the past 2 years. So, to a certain extent, if you play Rook, you have the highest chance of winning any single game that you go into. So, I feel like, by definition, that makes Rook a good operator. You also, again, have an ACOG on defense on a great SMG with absolutely no recoil. You have impacts, which are good for roaming if you want to go for a flank, denying utility, or anything in between, maybe even tricking walls. He has pretty good secondary pistols as well, and the ability to self-revive, which we've seen on Finka can be pretty powerful. And if you're holding really tight pixel angles as Rook where you have cover, you're going to be able to self-revive 9 times out of 10 if you play and position with Rook correctly. So I think Rook is pretty nice. It also takes an extra melee to down somebody with Rook if you're playing a shield, which is a great shield counter. So Rook is just a pretty good solo queue operator in my opinion. If you want to disagree with that though, then I completely understand. Next up is Fenrir. Fenrir is the second operator on my list to go into the S tier. Absolutely broken operator, even with the nerf. I guess like Twitch would be a good counter, but if you're good at positioning your Fenrirs and knowing where to activate them, when to activate them, I think Fenrir is pretty broken. Being able to swing people who cannot see you, and the fact that the blind persists even a second or 2 seconds after you've left the radius of the Fenrir is very, very nice. I like that a lot. You have a bailiff for sight setup, an MP7, which is just an easy control weapon. Barbed wire for information or a BP for information is pretty good as well. So I think Fenrir is just a broken operator in my opinion, and if they nerfed him again, I don't know that I would complain. I don't know that I would complain, to be completely honest. Next up, let's go over somebody who did get buffed recently, which is actually going to be Mozzie. I think Mozzie went from like a D tier pick to me to somebody who you could make an argument for A. You can make an argument for A. I do like Mozzie. The issue is that Mute is still just a better version of Mozzie, in my opinion. I don't find all too often that I'm going to go like, hey, let's roam with Mozzie. Vigil too. Vigil is just a way better version of Mozzie. So Mozzie, in my opinion, is a C tier operator. I do think him having a 4th pest is pretty cool. He went from D tier to C tier in my opinion, and I think that's kind of where he belongs, just as a concept of an operator. The P10 Roni is great. Having a Nitro Cell to be able to pair with information off of your drones is great too. Impacts if you want to roam, right? Still a good operator, just not really competing with people like Smoke, Scopos, Doc, or Capcan, or even Fenrir and Azami, in my opinion. Next up, let's go over an operator that I think is bad, that definitely needs a rework, and honestly the only operator in this tier, which is going to be Tachanka. Tachanka, I do think, is pretty bad. There are some situational uses where he can be good, and honestly, I don't think that, like, he's that bad of an operator compared to most people's conceptions, but even if you're not a bad operator, sometimes you just need to get reworked, which is why I'm putting Tachanka in the rework category. I think the fact that he has to reload his ability is dumb. If they took that out of the game, that would be a great quality of life change, because a lot of the times people will just sprint at you when you're reloading your ability and you'll die for it, and you won't be able to actually use your utility to deny plants or areas because you have to reload your ability. So I think if they took that out, that'd be great. I think if they made it an under barrel gadget, that would also be great. And even then, he still wouldn't be that good because his area of effect of his fire is really, really bad. So I think if maybe they did one of the 3 things that I suggested, he would be better. But until they do that, if they give him a full-on rework, that would be good too, which is why I'm putting him in the rework section. But for now, let's move on to operators that are just slightly better than Tachanka. The first of which being Sentry. I do think if you watch my attacker tier list I released a few days ago, that Striker is very, very good, because attacker secondary utility often is more impactful than defender secondary utility. Maybe not flash grenades anymore, because now you only get 2 flash grenades instead of 3, but still, having procs alarms and BP is not as powerful as having an EMP and a hard breach. Also, the guns that Sentry brings is just not that good. The Commando has a slow fire rate, no ACOG on it compared to Striker, who has an ACOG. So I think Sentry just lacks, mostly because of the fact that Defender secondary utility is just not as good as Attacker secondary utility. And there's nothing that this operator can do that other operators can't do, right? At least Striker, you have the ability to completely solo get a wall open by yourself. The only person that can do that on attack is like Maverick or Ace if there's no wall denial, right? Sentry doesn't bring anything new to the table, which is why I think he's bad, and he sucks to play because the Commando is kind of dog, in my opinion. Next up, I'm going to go over the 2 catchers in this video. We're going to go over Jaeger and Wamai. You can make an argument for A tier, or you can make an argument for C tier. I do think, now that there's less flashes in the game, now that you can't cook frag grenades, that catchers aren't honestly that important or as important as they were. There honestly are just more impactful operators in the game. Bringing in a Azami or a Fenrir is always going to be more impactful than bringing a Jaeger. Bringing a Smoke, bringing in a Rooney, bringing a Scopos, hell, even bringing a Doc can sometimes be more impactful than bringing a Wamai. I do think if you're protecting a Mira, these 2 operators become more valuable, but they're only really valuable if you're pairing it up with other operators, and you're not going to have that sort of cohesion if you're solo queuing. Again, this is a solo queue tier list, so I don't think that they belong in the A tier, unfortunately, because of the less value that secondary secondary gadgets have. So I'll put them in the C tier for now. I definitely think that they're good operators. Again, everybody in C tier is a good operator, just not really as good as somebody in the A or S tier, in my opinion. Next up, I'm going to go over Oryx. I have a pretty hot take on Oryx. I think he's situational. I think with the shield nerf, not having melee priority over anybody that is a non-shield player makes Oryx better, because you can't just like move out of the way of an Oryx and then melee him, or move out of the way and ADS him if the Oryx is the dumb player, right? Also, if you do end up being able to melee a Oryx, he's going to be able to ADS you or melee you back beforehand, making Oryx actually more of a lethal counter to shields. So I think in the niche situation where Oryx is against shields, I think he is situationally actually viable, especially if you're in a really tight hallway or somewhere like rafters where they can't move side to side and dodge your Oryx dash and they have to get Oryx dash. Oryx is pretty good in those scenarios. But aside from that, I think Oryx is pretty useless, which is why I put him in the situational category. Why do I think Oryx is useless though, and why do I think that Mozzie is C tier? That is because I'm comparing both of them to the next operator I'll talk about, which is Vigil. Vigil is probably the best roamer in the game. Some people want to put him in S tier purely for the fact that he has the boss G. I think if you are getting killed by the boss G and you think the boss G is overpowered, you don't know how to counter the boss G, and you don't know how to position yourself or swing or bait shots to go around the boss G. I'm sorry. Also, taking longer gunfights, this weapon, the Boss G, has drop-off damage. I don't know where the misconception came from that the Boss G didn't have drop-off damage, but the last time I tested it, it had drop-off damage. Maybe I'm wrong now, but I'm pretty sure it has drop-off damage. So just take longer gunfights, melee the quick peek so he baits a shot, and then you just sling him. It's not that hard. It really is not that hard, so I'm not going to put Vigilant S tier. I'm going to put him in A tier. I don't think the Boss G needs to get nerfed. Maybe just take away the ACOG on the Boss G, and then it'll be fine. But the ability's pretty good. Impact Grenade's pretty good. SMG-12, so nice to use once you know how to use it, which is why I put him in the A tier. Well, Warden, I will probably also put in the A tier. SMG-12 is great. Having a shotgun for sight setup is great. People are still going to be trying to use shields, especially early in the season before they realize that shields are worse, which means they're going to be rushing and planting. And if people rush and plant, they're going to be doing it with flashes and smokes, making Warden still pretty meta. Also, just bringing a Warden is never really going to be harmful. You have a deployable shield or a nitro cell, which is great for sight. You have the ability to counter any flashes or any smokes or shields because you can shotgun their shield. The SMG-12 is also a laser if you know how to control it. So I think Warden's an A tier pick for me. Oh, I already went over attackers. I was going to talk about Blackbeard. Let's talk about operators that are a tad bit worse than Warden, though, and that is going to be my next operator, Pulse. I don't think Pulse is that good, to be honest. Like, you could say he's situational, but even in that situation, you could just bring Solus, and I feel like it'd be better, in my opinion. Nah, I think Pulse is better than Solus in those situations. So let's put Pulse in situational. There's some sites, like let's say the split site on Consulate, where Pulse can be good, right? You can just deny the plant from downstairs. But other sites, I don't think it makes sense. There's like 3 sites where it makes sense to play Pulse, and that's it. But on those 3 sites, he can be pretty good, so I'll give that to him. Next up, let's go over Legion. Legion is a solid A tier pick. I don't want to say he's S tier because shields aren't meta anymore, but he's still pretty good. You have a lot of information. You have a T5 SMG, which is easy to control. Super shorty to help set up sight. What more do I really say? He's just a good operator. Pretty all-around, well-rounded good operator. Next up is going to be Ela. I think Ela's a good C tier pick. Her utility, like her primary ability, is not as good as the people up here, in my opinion. Just not that good. But the weapons are great. You bring a deployable shield. Did I mention that the weapons are great? The weapons are great. I love using her weapons. But that's pretty much it. A 3-speed 2, pretty nice, and the ability to counter shields is pretty good too. So I'll give Ela a solid C tier. Not as bad as these operators, but not as good as these operators in my opinion. Next up, let's go for Frost. I think Frost is a solid A tier pick. Again, a very high win rate defender, in the same league in terms of win rate as like Kapkan and Rook. So she's won with a lot. You have an ACOG and an easy to control SMG. We talked about how good that is on Doc and Rook. A deployable shield too. A shotgun for sight setup. Her ability can down people. At most, if they shoot it, it's information, right? Or a BP as well if you want to use that instead of a deployable shield. So Frost is a pretty good operator in my opinion for solo queue. Somebody else who I think is pretty good for solo queue specifically is our next operator, which is going to be Goyo. Goyo, solid A tier pick for me. The Vector with an ACOG, what more do I gotta say? That weapon is absolutely banging. I love that weapon to death. Impact grenades too, very nice to have. The Goyo canisters themselves are pretty low skill floor. You can use them and get a lot of value out of them, but the better you are with them, the better they will be. The more man count that you have compared to them as well, the higher value Goyo canisters get. So I do think Goyo is a solid A tier pick, especially in solo queue for me. Next up, let's go over Mute. Mute is a solid A tier. I don't think they need to nerf Mute, so I'm not going to put him in S tier. But Mute is a great solo queue operator. Do not get me wrong. You can counter Deimos, you can counter Dokubi, you can counter Lion, you can counter Grim. You have the ability to counter drones, keep walls closed, shotgun SMG-11 combo, and a nitro cell. Such a versatile operator. Love Mute to death. Speaking of versatile operators, let's go over Melusi. I love Melusi. 4 Banshees, a lot of information there. Impact grenades, secondary shotgun for sight setup, an MP5, which we talked about on these 2 operators being good. What more do I gotta say? She's versatile and gives information. Somebody else who is versatile and gives information is our next operator, Valkyrie. Valkyrie, you can put high A, maybe S tier. I think if there were like a tier in between here, I'd put him in between S and A. But for now, I'll put him in A. I don't think that like Valkyrie needs to be nerfed, but man, do I hate going against Valkyrie. I mean, you can just bring IQ and counter her, so it's not that big of a deal, but still Valkyrie's really, really good. MPX, great weapon. Deagle for sight setup, Nitro Cell for kills. or for information kills with your cameras. 3 hidden cameras that cannot be found unless they have an IQ if you position them correctly, which I love about Valkyrie. Somebody else who has cameras that's slightly worse than Valkyrie, though, is Maestro. I'm going to put Maestro in the same tier as Echo because they're kind of the same operator. They just do different jobs. Love the LMG, love the bailiff for sight setup, love the impacts or observation blockers if you use them with the Maestro cameras. But the Maestro cameras themselves, I find a lot of the times don't get as much value as I'd want them to get. I don't think Maestro's as good a defender as like Smoke or Mute. I think anybody would tell you that. So I'll put Maestro in the C tier for now. Again, still a good operator, right? Just not quite in like the higher echelon. Now, I'm going to go over the final defender, the one you've all been waiting on the entire video, the one that got a huge buff this season, which is Thunderbird. If you don't know, Thunderbird got the buff to where you could passively heal with her Kona stations. I've been saying that that should be something that she gets for a while now, and did it, which is cool, but I don't think she has enough. She's lacking in secondary utility. She doesn't have an ACOG on her spear. She does have a secondary shotgun now too, but you're going to be using the Bearing 9 most of the time, so that doesn't really do anything. But she did go from like bottom of the barrel operator to, at minimum, I would say D tier. Passive healing is pretty cool, but she lacks in everything else, and until she gets anything else, I don't want to put her anywhere above D tier, to be honest. She does have a deployable shield, but so does Thorn, right? So you could just do what Thunderbird does, but bring a dock and do it better, in my opinion. So I'm gonna stick Thunderbird not in F tier, but in D tier. She did move up a tier for me, but not quite where she needs to be, in my opinion. Maybe give her like 50 initial healing, and then she'd be good. But until then, gonna be in the last tier for me. But that's it for today's video. My name is Alka. Check out the next video, and I hope to see you there. Later.